Hi, my name is Ambrosiussen, and today I'm going to talk about the SideFXLabs toolset. SideFXLabs toolset is a completely free open source toolset geared towards assisting Houdini users with a variety of tasks commonly used for digital content creation. The toolset is being developed by Louise Correll, Mike Linden, and myself, and it was previously called GameDevelopmentToolset. So we've rebranded the toolset from GameDevelopmentToolset to SideFXLabs. I'll talk a bit more about that on the next couple of slides. But in the meantime, I'd want to give a quick refresher on what the toolset is for those that don't know it yet. So the toolset is completely free. It's open source. It's hosted on GitHub, which is where we do all of our development, meaning that you as a user, if you're using GitHub, you can download the toolset from there immediately. It has over 150 plus tools. We provide daily updates. So let's say you find a bug or you have a suggestion or an improvement that you'd like to see, you can contact our support team at support@sidefx.com, where they will enter it into a database. And then as soon as we look at that issue and we've implemented it or fixed a problem you've had, we submit it to GitHub, and then we will make a release, and that means that if you're installing the toolset from within Houdini, you will be able to have that fixed the very next day. The toolset also focuses mainly on workflow and user experience, because one of our goals is to make Houdini easier to use and to provide an easier platform to use with, for example, integrations that we've developed, such as Substance, Gaia, Rhizome UV, Instant Meshes, Exoside Quad Remesher, and a lot more. So this rebranding from the Game Development Toolset to SideFXLabs. First of all, why did we do that? Well, we've seen that the workflows for film and game have been, getting closer and closer to each other. The main one being virtual production, right, where people take a film workflow and they use it in an engine like Unity or Unreal. Which is where some techniques that we've been using in the games industry for quite a while, which is of course what the Game Development Toolset helps with, comes in really, really handy. This doesn't, however, mean that our focus as the games team that develops this toolset has changed from it primarily being the game dev workflow. That is not true. Our main focus very much still is game development. This rebranding, however, does allow us to include some more tools that might help people specifically for a film workflow. Because what we've done with this renaming to SideFXLabs is give the rest of the SideFX staff, in the R&D department, the ability to contribute to it as well. So if one of the people working on, for example, Pyro, comes up with a really great tool that isn't quite ready for prime time in Houdini proper, we can submit it or publish it using SideFXLabs, giving users the ability to test it, play with it, and provide us feedback, giving us useful insights for future tool developments. In addition to the things I mentioned before, we've now also shipped the toolset with Houdini. So you no longer need an active internet connection to use and install the toolset. It now ships in the little directory you see here, so the Houdini install directory /Houdini/public, where you'll find a zip file containing a toolset. The automatic updater inside of Houdini will use this zip file to install the toolset. We now also ship the plugins that we compile with Houdini itself, because some of the plugins, like for example Substance, need to be compiled against every single version of Houdini. So they're very version specific. So we've now actually done that in our build farm, where we compile these plugins, providing the best possible compatibility with Houdini. We've also enhanced deployment since the release of SideFXLabs. We've introduced a new concept in Houdini called packages, which is a much easier way of managing your Houdini environment and installing plugins like SideFXLabs. This means that you no longer have to modify your Houdini environment. We've also done a bit better of a job in terms of getting involved with the R&D department working on Houdini itself. We've been very active educating the R&D department on real-time workflows. We've seen some very, very interesting changes online from some other parties. And of course, we've been doing some of that work ourselves and given some insights on what we think should happen next with Houdini. We've also been actively looking at PDG, tools that PDG has, the workflows that it currently has, and providing some feedback in terms of how we could make it easier for users to use, how we could provide some more interesting tools, missing tools, and so forth. And of course, we've also already had some R&D contributions that we ship with SideFXLabs, one of which is some really great flame tools. I'm also happy to say that we've also been documenting every single tool in SideFXLabs. So if you click the little question mark or hover your mouse over one of the parameters, you'll actually get a tooltip and some useful documentation. When you go to our website, under products, you can also find this web page describing SideFXLabs in more detail. It lists some of the plugins that we've made or integrations. It lists some very useful tutorials, but it also has this really great page where you can see, first of all, how to install it. You can have a link to GitHub, but it also lists every single tool in SideFXLabs. So if you aren't quite sure if it's in SideFXLabs, you can go to this page and find out yourself. So let's go to a couple of new tools that we've released since last year's GDC. The first one I want to mention is Straight Skeleton 2D. So this is a tool where you can feed in a 2D polygon or a multitude of 2D polygons. For example, these digits 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. And then what Straight Skeleton does is it extracts the sort of spine of this shape, which means that you can use that for example, resampling it and copying lights onto that, giving you some really interesting looking objects. Or you can use it to draw on a surface of geometry and then extract a spine and place fences on it and so forth. So it's a really, really useful tool. We've also created a 3D version of that, where you feed it a 3D mesh. This mesh needs to be closed because it's doing some VDB magic under the hood. And then what it does, it once again extracts that spline. And this is really useful for example, extracting a directionality from a mesh. So imagine you have a cylindrical object or a stroke of a brush or something like that. Once you extract this spine, you can use that to calculate direction so that you can have something flow over the surface of that 3D geometry. We've also added another really great tool. It's not necessarily a tool, it's sort of a script that you can find from the file menu. But sometimes Houdini crashes. Most of the times, of course, it doesn't. But in the case that it does crash, we've provided a utility tool where under the file menu, you can now find this option called Open Crash File, which will copy the crash file from the temporary directory back to wherever it was saved previously or your working directory, and then it will open up that file for you. This makes it a lot easier to recover any work you might have lost due to a crash, of course, whenever it does save a crash file. And that makes life a lot easier in case Houdini does crash. Just a quick reminder, Houdini should never crash. If it does, please do contact support so that we can find the issue and fix it. Another thing that we've learned from releasing the tool sets in the past, we of course update our tools quite frequently to solve bugs, to implement new features and so forth, which means that sometimes we bump the version of the tool set, right? So we make a new definition, and therefore in the tool namespace we add a new version number. So if, for example, the first time when we released the Maps Baker, you were to create a node instance of that tool, you would get labs Maps Baker, and then after a couple of months we might have bumped the version of the tool set to 2.0. This would mean that we would now have a different definition. And if you were to update the toolset while you still had definition 1 in your network, it wouldn't update this node to be using version 2, right? To make sure that it doesn't break backward compatibility. This does, however, mean that your network wouldn't get the updates that we've made in version 2. Same goes with version 3, right? So in the support tickets we got, we quite frequently saw that people didn't quite get the updates that we made, even though we had already released them. And this is because of that issue I just mentioned. So we also provided a tool that allows you to automatically scan your HIVE files, finding these out-of-date tools. To see which version of a tool you're currently using, you can either go to Asset Manager and here under the Asset bar, set this option to Display Menu of All Definitions, which will give you this little drop down in your parameter interface. But you can also just middle mouse on a node in your network, giving you this pop-up, also showing you which version it is you're using. To see which versions of SideFXLabs tools might be out of date, under the Assets tab, right in the top menu bar, we now added this option called Check Asset Versions in Scene, and this will scan through all of your nodes in your file, telling you which ones are out of date. So that makes it a lot easier to see if you're using out of date definitions. Then another really big tool that we added since last year's GDC is photogrammetry using LSVision. LSVision is a completely free and once again open source implementation of a photogrammetry solution. And we've packed it up in a variety of nodes, the top one being LSVision photogrammetry. And this node wraps up the entire workflow or network of nodes that you would have to create if you were to create every single node by yourself, which of course you might still want to do if you want to fine tweak some very specific settings. But in general, this node, is really easy to set up and allows you to do photogrammetry in a really straightforward way. The only thing you have to do is install LSVision, which is described in the tutorial online. You have a library of images, which you tell the node to use, and then it automatically scans all of that and generates this mesh, which we see here, which you can then plug into some other post-processing nodes, like for example our delight node, our automatic UV node, one of our quad remeshers, which I'll talk about in a little bit, giving you, something that's really great to work with for your game engine. And here we see a great looking result coming out of LSVision. After you've done your photogrammetry scan, you might want to generate a quad mesh. So we've also done an integration for the Exoside quad remesher, and it's a really great tool. And if you, for example, feed it this triangulated mesh, or this one, you plug it in and you tell the tool to generate a quad mesh with 5,000 quads, it generates an output that looks like this, which is a really great result for an automatic quad remesher. As you can see, it has some options in terms of adaptive size, some edge loop controls, and a little bit more, which you can't see in this image. But this tool is just really great to use if you want to quad remesh something using a third-party solution. It does require you to have a license for Exoside quad remesher, but it's fairly inexpensive. I'd like to refer you to their website to read more about it. So once you have your quad mesh or your triangle mesh, depending on what it is you want, you of course need to UV it. Houdini, of course, has some great UVing tools, but still some users prefer to use Rhizome UVs or have some other reasons to do that. So they asked if we could provide a bridge allowing you to use the functionality of Rhizome UV straight from within Houdini, which is great for automating a workflow. So we did that. We created some nodes that take the functionality of Rhizome UV and call it through command line, giving you some great UVs straight out of the box. So that's what this Rhizome UV Unwrap does. As you can see, it has some options that you can play with. And once you have that, you can use any of the other nodes to, for example, optimize it, to process some more of it, or to rectangularize some mesh. So here we can see the original mesh after it was, after we pelted it using the Rhizome UV Unwrap node. And then this one is processed using the Rhizome UV Optimize node, where you can see, it made some more cuts, relaxing the mesh, reducing any of the stretching. And here we can see that parameter interface that I was mentioning before, where you have access to some of the functionality that Rhizome offers within their software straight from within Houdini, meaning you can, automate this, wrap it up in a, for example, a PDG script or network, processing, hundreds of meshes without having to open a different application to do some UVs. Another really big request from users has been an integration with Substance. So we're also pleased to announce that we've done one of those. So that integration has been done using COPS. where you can actually load up a substance archive file, and Houdini will get all of the parameters that substance file has within Substance Designer, allowing you to tweak those from within Houdini. And then it spits out, all these image planes straight into COPS, giving you, for example, the diffuse, the roughness, normal, whatever else you have in the substance archive. And then we have this substance material node, which automatically loads all of these and configures it to be a PBR material, allowing you to preview it straight in the viewport in Houdini, making it a super powerful workflow, because now you can basically have procedural 3D geometry, and then on top of that, you can have procedural shaders, right, using Substance. And this, of course, also makes it a lot easier in terms of workflow and UX, because if you remember from one of the first slides, we wanted it to make it easier for artists to use Houdini. And this is one of those efforts improving that experience. So like I mentioned on the previous slide, you can have 3D geometry and then procedural shaders. Well, here's an example of a workflow, right, where you can do a simulation with some geometry from Houdini. You can use any of our highly sophisticated simulation tools, have it fall on, for example, a flat grid, and then bake that to a flat plane, bring it into a substance network, allowing you to create a great shader out of that. And now you just have a fully procedural material without any intersections, using both Houdini and Substance at the same time. And you can even wrap this up into a tool and bring that into, for example, a game engine, and have it run Houdini and Substance straight from within a game engine. Next up, I mentioned baking. We've also released a new baking tool since last year's GDC, which we call Maps Baker, which is a COPS-based maps baker. And it's really, 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 really fast. It's an order of magnitude faster than the built-in Mantra bake texture node, because it's fully COPS-based and it's all VEX, bypassing all the sort of generation steps that Mantra would have to do. Right, so it just does the bare essentials. The tool has a lot of things to offer. Since the last time you might have seen it, because we promoted this tool quite a bit. You plug in your low poly, your high poly, and your optional cage object. And then in the tool itself, you can specify the resolution. You can specify the tracing mode. We've added a couple of new options since the last time we've mentioned it. We've added a surface normal based tracing mode and also a cage based mode. We've added the ability to visualize the cage you're baking against. And we've also exposed a lot of properties that the users have been requesting, like, for example, gamma control right from the user interface without having to do any post-processing on the images that it generates. Like I mentioned, it's all in COPS. So if you dive inside of the Maps Baker, you can see that this is all the logic that it's doing in terms of the image generation step. There are, of course, some nodes in the SOP network, but this is the main thing you'd have to tweak if you want to modify it. And what this would allow you to do is, for example, grab this ambient occlusion node, grab your vertex color node, and then combine those, multiply them together, and then just tell it that every time I bake out vertex colors, I want it to automatically be multiplied by my AO. Or take your world normals and, for example, put something in the Z channel or the normal tangent texture. That's usually what people do. So that makes it really, really easy, and it's once again fully editable. So you can go inside and modify it to suit your needs, or even remove things to optimize it even more. The tool also now has UDIM support. It has animated frame ranges support, and it has a lot more since the last time we've promoted it. So definitely check it out again. Then we've also released a building generator. So here are some images showing that building generator inside of Unity, where the user is able to take a blockout mesh, which is usually just a box or a couple of boxes pushed together, generating a building out of it using building modules. So this is the parameter interface for the building generator, where you feed it building modules that all have a name. So these ledges, for example, are called F2_T_ledge_1. A door is just called door, and a window is called window. These are all user-defined names. So this is just what I decided to pick. You you specify some properties, like for example, how tall you want the floors to be in general, right? So in this case, it's 6 meters. And then you can specify whether or not you want to have ledges, right? A top ledge and a bottom ledge, in addition to the facade. That one's always there. Where you can specify what the height has to be for every single ledge. The top ledge has to be 1. The bottom ledge has to be 0.85. And then it, removes that from the floor, and it puts all of these, building modules on there, allowing you to highly customize your building generation. It also has overrides on a per floor level, where you can, for example, say, the first floor has to be twice as high and use these different building modules. But in addition to that, it also has volumetric overrides, where you can specify with a bounding box that, for example, in a vertical fashion, in this part, I want to have fire escape ladders. Or you can also use manual overrides, where you can take, a big showpiece and just drag it to a specific region, and the tool will, place that building module there and adjust everything around it. So we have a really great tutorial about this tool, which you can find on the SideFX website, where you just need to look for building generator tutorial. Then we've also released an XYZ point cloud exporter, where you just have a point cloud with vertex colors applied to it. You plug it into the tool, you specify which node to export, and then you can import that straight into Unreal using their new plugin, allowing you to, for example, bring in a really dense photogrammetry scan using just point clouds, or a terrain, or anything else like that, which you can use for game dev purposes or for cinematics and whatnot. Then we've also built a wave function collapse solver, which you can learn more about in a different presentation later today, or online if you're watching it after the HIVE sessions, which is basically a constraint solver using the wave function collapse algorithm. What this tool does in just a couple of lines is it takes an input image as a sample, it cuts it up into smaller patterns using a size that you specify, and then it reassembles those puzzle pieces that it creates in a different layout, meaning that you can create an image that looks very, very similar but different using just an image as a reference, which is, for example, great for bitmap generation, or for level generation, or for greeble generation, or just data generation in general. But more about this tool is being covered in a different presentation later today, once again. And here we see that tool generating a level. So this is just a proxy view or proxy geometry view. But essentially, we have 3 tools: an initialize tool, which sets up a grid like you see here. We have a sample paint node, which allows you to paint a sample that the tool will use to, or the algorithm will use to generate an output, and then the actual solver to create, something like this from an input image like this. Then we also wanted to do some work on the modeling side of things. So we created a tool called Box Cutter. That's just a temporary name. It will be renamed in the future, but for now it's called Box Cutter, which is an interactive Boolean tool. So Boolean is a really, really powerful tool inside of Houdini, but it's sometimes a bit difficult to use if you want to interactively Boolean some shapes out of geometry. So that's where a Box Cutter comes in, where you plug in a piece of geometry you want to modify using Booleans, and then all you do is just click and drag on that shape to place Boolean shapes. So in this case, it's just boxes that we're cutting out of this piece of geometry, but you can Boolean using anything, like for example a pig head or a tube or a different shape. And then it has a variety of controls, including, for example, creating duplicates or copies. As you can see here, it allows you to make any of the previous steps that you've done live again. So if you, for example, aren't quite happy with one of the steps you've made as the first operation, you can go back, make that live again, and you'll have your handle back, and you can tweak it back to be the way you want. Then we've also done some work on the on terrain integrations. Some of you might know Gaia. Gaia is a really, really great terrain software out there. that's highly specialized in terrains and creating terrains and eroding them. And people have been requesting for us to make a plugin or a bridge inside of Houdini, and we've done that. So what you can do is you can open Gaia, you can create a network of nodes, for example, generating a mountain or a hill or something like this, where you can specify a file input for a mask, for example, or for a terrain that you want to erode or do some operations on, and then you want to output that as a terrain. Well, you can do this exact same thing and bring that workflow you saw before into Houdini using the Tor processor. So with the Tor processor, you can load up any of the Gaia files that you've created and save to disk, and you will get all of the parameters that you've exposed, right? So for example, on this erosion example, you have the properties that Gaia offers, like for example, duration, rock softness, strength, and so forth. But it also allows you to plug in any of the height field masks. So instead of generating a terrain from scratch within Gaia, you can actually plug in the height field that you've generated in Houdini and have Gaia process that using the network graph you saw before. In this case, the erosion, right, where you plug in the height and the mask, and then it spits out the eroded height, the eroded mask, deposit mask, and a flow mask. And then you can have all of those layers back in Houdini to do any further processing with it. So this, once again, really great pipeline tool, allowing you to bring these artist-focused workflows that Gaia offers into Houdini, so that Houdini offers you to use it as a backbone pipeline. Another really cool tool made using Python states is this viewport measure tool, which allows you to interactively in the viewport click and drag to create a ruler telling you the distance or the angle between 2 points or 3 points. This is really useful for example, measuring specific parts of geometry, where, for example, you have this window module, which you're going to use for the building generator, and you want to know how wide it is or how tall it is. You can just click and drag, and you will see what the distance is, rather than having to open the geometry spreadsheet and see what the values are there. Which is especially useful if you want to, for example, measure the distance between these 2 points rather than the bounding box of the entire object. Next up, we've also done some work on integrating PDG into the SideFXLabs, or rather the SideFXLabs into PDG. We've made quite a few tools that people use a lot compatible with PDG. We, for example, made MapsBaker fully compatible, where you would just drop down a ROP fetch top, specify that you want to extract data from the MapsBaker, and it would automatically bake using the MapsBaker straight from within PDG. We've also made vertex animation textures compatible, or VAT, like most people call it, where it now properly tells you what the files are that got generated. It gives you the geometry and the textures as part of the data that the work item holds. We've also made Gaia compatible with PDG, allowing you to, for example, take a really big landscape and cut it up and process it tiled using PDG, where Gaia, for example, erodes or processes any of these terrain tiles. We've also added 2 new tools to PDG using labs, one of which is the cut geometry to partitions, which once again is a tool allowing you to spread out the work, right? To parallelize it, where if you, for example, have a really big photogrammetry mesh and you want to polyreduce all of those as smaller chunks, this will cut that big mesh up into smaller partitions and then allows you to process those individually. We've also added a node called filter by value, which is an enhancement to the wedge workflow, because with wedges you basically wedge a value, right, giving you a variety of numbers to play with. And then, after you've found a couple of seed values that you like, the filter by value allows you to filter the work items by specific values, which is a big enhancement. Then, last but not least, I want to mention that with the release of SideFXLabs, we've also included some new test geometry. We added a 3D scan of both Louise and myself that people have been using for some fun things, as you can see in these videos. So shout out to the 2 individuals of which I added the Twitter handles at the bottom of the slides. But basically, it's geometry and textures that you can use to do anything you want with it. And with that, I'd like to thank you. And if you have any follow-up questions, please let us know, because we'd like to hear what it is you do with SideFXLabs. We'd love to hear any problems you have. And last but not least, we of course also want to hear any improvements you might have thought of. And with that, I'd like to thank you and goodbye.